All right, this is the third lecture for chapters 5 and 6. And we just finished up this slide last time, so we'll move on over. So looking at this little description, I like this one, where it kind of shows, again, using the latitude, which is us moving along the Earth's surface from the equator over here on the left towards the poles on the right-hand side. And you notice how the precipitation changes. You have tropical rainforest, and then you get to forests like what we have that change colors and drop their leaves because it gets too cold. And then eventually the trees make adaptations and they have needles. They become a coniferous forest, so they can hold their needles all year long. And then eventually you get to some point where it's just not going to work. It's just too cold and dry up at the poles. Whoops, let me go back to that. And then you have a very similar phenomenon when you're going up in elevation, where things will change and you eventually will get no vegetation up here up at the mountains. But of course you can have tropical rainforest here at the grounds level or at the base. All right, characterizing biomes again. These are the things that help distinguish one biome from the other. You have the temperature and you have precipitation. So I'm not going to spend too much time here. You can, take a look and read these. These are a little bit general, but it gives you a pretty good idea as, kind of marking where you're at. And we're going to do an activity in class in which we will kind of do this. We'll do this guesswork. So these are just a few of the biomes that we will look at in this chapter. Let me just go back there so don't rip through it too quickly. You can kind of see on the names in those, some of them are probably a little familiar, some of them maybe not so much. Climatograms. So we're going to do a bunch of climatograms, and we're going to see some here that'll help us kind of get a better understanding of different biomes relative to the precipitation and the climate. So just a couple things to point out on these things is when you look at a climatogram, these are some of the things that we can infer about them. But then there's some things that you just don't know. You don't know the wind patterns or how humid it is. So some things you're not going to be able to tell the difference of based on just the climatogram itself. All right, here's our first three. And you can see that these are all deserts. And notice they don't have to be hot. A desert can be polar. So you can look at the temperature changes. So the main thing we're looking at here is the precipitation. It's very little precipitation, which is what calls it a desert. But the temperature can vary quite a bit. You have your tropical ones, of course, that you can see the temperature is always just really, really high and not much fluctuation. And then you have the temperate, which is sort of near us, and it can vary throughout the year. And then you can have polar, which varies just a little bit more. Grasslands and Chaparral. For this, you're maybe thinking, part of it depends on, like Chaparral is like California. San Francisco, even California, or Los Angeles would be considered like Chaparral. Sometimes called Mediterranean too, as well. So you can kind of take a look at some of the different locations there where you're going to have many times a rainy season, and then the rest of the year just doesn't have much at all. And you can see that fluctuating. One of the other things is just to notice is this pattern can be switched. In other words, it could be very wet in the winter and very dry in the summer, or in those summer months that we typically call it. But that just tells you based on being a northern hemisphere or a southern hemisphere location. And you'll see those examples of that as we're going along. So I'm kind of purposely going through these a little bit quickly. Grasslands and chaparrals, you can kind of see again, looking at the verbiage I'm putting on here. Cold winters, dry, hot summers. You can also think a good example of these is like the savannas of Africa. Forest biomes, that middle one should look kind of familiar to you. That's us. And you have the tropical rainforest. Notice that temperature is pretty steady all year round. And you can have fluctuations in the precipitation. Don't necessarily have to, but you can. The temperate deciduous forest, that should look very much like us. And again, you can also have a fluctuation in the precipitation, but you get those warm part of the year and cooler part of the year. And then you can have a little more on a, not necessarily polar, but on the northern end. And you can think of these as being even a coniferous type forest. And again, coniferous forest can also be shown, as they put on here, a boreal or a taiga. So these are some of the things that are identifying as being a tropical rainforest, and you're probably somewhat familiar with those already. So there's two different types of rainforest. There's a tropical rainforest, and then there is a well, it's not right here. It's a temperate forest. This is deciduous. Deciduous forest means, of course, the leaves will drop in the fall and it becomes dormant because it's too cold for those leaves to do their thing, transferring a water solution, if you will, through the leaves. It's too cold, it's frozen. Here you have your evergreen forest, and shows the difference with that. You have a lot more of the needled evergreen type trees, cone bearing. Here's our temperate rainforest. And you can see that these are typically quite a lot of rain. I'm trying to find the right words for that. But we have one here in the United States, a temperate rainforest, which would be coastal Washington, and then it actually goes up through Canada into Alaska. So parts of Alaska have temperate rainforests all the way up there. And here's a map that kind of shows some of that. Well, not so much. This is the aquatics. I take that back. Sorry. So these are looking at the aquatic biomes, which are different as far as how do you categorize them. So apparently we're not doing that yet. Well, that'll come up a little bit later. These are just some of the things you will find in aquatic biomes, and then based upon where they live. So you should be somewhat familiar with some of these names. I'm not going to spend time just going over them with you. You can see them right on there. Here we go. This is what I was looking at earlier. So normally as we categorize terrestrial biomes, we do that with the temperature and the precipitation. We don't do aquatic biomes the same way. We do it with those, salinity, depth, and water flow. So that tells you one, in other words, is it a lake or is it the ocean? Or is it where the two might meet, like a river, a delta? And we'll see how that comes in here in a little bit. Sometimes a misconception is thinking that the oceans, while all the way out in the ocean, there's life everywhere. Not really. It's kind of like the land. There's areas where you're going to find life and areas where you're not going to find life. But as you can see on here, most of life in the ocean is found right by the land. Almost all of it. When you get out into the middle of the ocean, there's not much out there. So you have to follow the nutrients. And again, it's the base of the food chain. So you're looking for this upwelling, which we talked about earlier in one of the lectures, that provides nutrients, and then things start living, and then you get the whole trophic levels moving along, and that's where life is going to be found. You don't have the same thing going out in the ocean unless something happens to be passing through, like whales or some other aquatic life. This just shows us some of the species that you may find at different depths in the ocean, and then based upon the light that goes in. So the euphotic level is where light will penetrate, and you get certain amounts of life in that area. And then you have the bathyal zone, which has very little light kind of penetrating that layer. And then the abyssal zone where there's no light at all. So you still have things that live down there, but usually they're using something called chemfluorescence in order to see if they need to see it all. Estuaries and wetlands, these are some of the most nutrient-rich, bioproductive areas on the planet, going right along with tropical rainforests. That's always a question out there, is like, what is the most productive area on the planet? You can say tropical rainforests or estuaries or swamps. Those are your answers for those questions. It comes up all the time. And that little formula there is grams of carbon per meter squared per year. So grams of carbon. So it's looking at productivity. Okay, we talked about this before, ecological services. These are things that nature does for us for free. You don't have to pay for it, but we benefit from it. So all these things are like just having what we called before a riparian next to our creek. It does a service for us. So it filters out pollutants. It slows down water flow when you have these storms. It absorbs it and holds that moisture for later. And then it just provides all this biodiversity that we all benefit from. Okay, this is a good place to take a break, and we'll start another one after that.